Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry. I'm a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, today we are checking out another list because who doesn't love lists? And this one caught my eye because I love history and I'm a teacher and I teach history because this list is top 10 historical events school doesn't teach you about. So this is by WatchMojo, very popular mainstream channel. And I'm interested to see what they think is deserving of a top 10 list on this. So without further waiting, let's check this out. All right, so I want to know down in the comments what you think of this list. Are there other things that they haven't covered that you think are more deserving? Yeah, let me know down below. All right, what do you got?
And then, in the words of the sheriff, all hell broke loose.
And the worst single incident of racial violence in American history begins.
Welcome to WatchMojo, and today we're counting down our picks for the top 10 major
TULSA,
historical events school didn't teach you about.
When the news reporters...
By the way, if you didn't know much about WatchMojo and if you've seen their lists, they do tend to be American-centric, so keep that in mind.
asked me, why didn't I get up? I said, history had me glued to the seat.
For this list, we'll be looking at famous and important moments in the world's history that educators either touched upon briefly or completely ignored, leaving us to discover them on the internet. What other events did schools fail to teach us about? Let us know below. Number 10, the Mao Massacre. In 1966, Mao Zedong's power in China was threatened after the disastrous Great Leap Forward that caused a massive famine. So he initiated the Cultural Revolution to renew the communist spirit and remove infiltrators.
Mao launches an attack on his internal political opponents, saying there are bureaucrats everywhere who want capitalism back. The people ought to display placards and expose these class enemies and their bourgeois thinking.
This caused youths to form groups like the Red Guard, who shut down schools, ransacked religious places, and slaughtered any perceived enemies of Mao's vision, such as party officials and intellectuals.
Mao sends his Red Guards into a war of symbols. He considers China's traditions and culture to be anti-socialist and seeks to destroy them.
While art and entertainment believed to be too Western were banned, including work by William Shakespeare. The Cultural Revolution eventually finished in 1976 with Mao's passing, but not before it destroyed the country's economy, took the lives of up to 2 million people, and forced around 20 million to flee the carnage Chairman Mao instigated.
Now is the Rega generation 70. I hope that they reflect, they regret, they re-examine. What should we prevent this kind of human tragedy happen again?
Number 9.
Okay, so first off, I know for me and all the teachers I know, we all teach that. We all teach about kind of this era, the Maoist era in China, and the events they're talking about, the Great Leap Forward, which was to try to supercharge China into industrialization under the auspices of the Communist Party under Mao Zedong. And yeah, there was with the Great Famine, which, you know, was kind of right at the turn of the 60s. And yeah, millions ended up dying for various reasons, but a lot of it but it being starvation. And then the Cultural Revolution, which took after, which ended up purging a lot of what they described was, again, bourgeoisie tendencies. And yeah, it was very much motivated to the students and young people, you know, student age. And a lot of that was because something Mao had kind of feared was that kind of generation 2 of Chinese communists were not a part of the, you know, the glory days, if you want to call them, of the early Chinese revolution, because it was all about like revolution as a sign or as a way of change and taking pride in that. And then since, you know, you had this generation that was going to be growing up and saw the horrible famine and all that stuff, that their kind of love for the policies that were supposed to be behind the spirit of Chinese communism was dying. So they you know, really tried to hit the youth with that. And yeah, they actually used them as a tool and ended up using for a lot of repressive reasons and stuff like that. But I can tell you it's taught. If it wasn't taught, it's because if you didn't hear it in your classes, it wasn't because it wasn't part of the curriculum. It was a decision, teachers not finishing the pacing guides or not even having pacing guides to make sure you finish everything in the year. Very common, especially in the older days, to not really teach much about anything after World War II in a lot of a lot of classes. So anyway, I can tell you, teach it. It's a big part, and brings in good conversations in the classroom.
The Wall Street attack.
Okay.
Before 9/11, the worst terror attack in the United States happened in 1920. During midday in September, a horse-drawn carriage rode down Wall Street, New York. It stopped outside the U.S. Assay Office and opposite the J.P. Morgan and Company building.
On September 16, 1920, as the bells of Trinity Church tolled and hundreds of Wall Street workers headed out for their noontime break, an explosion struck outside the headquarters of J.P. Morgan and Company.
The area was packed as workers went to get lunch, but then the driver vanished. Moments later, the wagon filled with dynamite exploded, causing shrapnel to fly everywhere.
The carnage was unlike anything America's largest city had ever seen and was splashed across headlines for days.
At least 38 people and the horse perished from the attack, with 143 seriously injured. No group or individual came forward to claim responsibility. While authorities had many theories on who was responsible, no formal arrest ever happened, and it remains unsolved.
And in the end, no one was ever formally convicted of this heinous crime. Today, the only evidence that remains from that tragic event are from these shrapnel marks on the facade of J.P. Morgan's old building.
Number 8.
Okay, I can tell you, yeah, this is not something generally taught, and I already can figure out why. Because just from seeing what they're talking about here, and you saw it, that usually when you have an attack like this, and it definitely seems to be motivated for the fact of whether it's anti-capitalist, whatever it is, of doing it outside of like JP Morgan's institution there. He's one of the richest men that's ever lived and huge financier. But what's interesting about that, and probably why it didn't get popular, is it didn't get claimed by any individual group. Attacks like this want to be made popularized and be connected to some kind of message, right? Otherwise, what's the point? Okay, because you don't want people to have to infer for themselves what the message was about this. If this was more of, again, popularly, they leave notes or whoever it is, that are saying is responsible for this, then you could really put it in very easily and very effectively, put it into some kind of lesson where you talk about how like Americans maybe have responded, ways that they responded to economic situations or something like that. So I think if it had more of an explanation publicly, then you'd probably see it taught a lot more, because it is a very interesting, powerful event. So that's what I think. Iranian Revolution. Okay. Again, I'll tell you about this.
The Iranian Revolution. After years of Iran being reigned by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and aligning himself with the West, tensions came to a head in 1978.
Daily, it has become more difficult to look at the scope of opposition to the Shah of Iran and still see his monarchy surviving. The Ayatollahs are committed to the ouster of the Shah and nothing less than that.
Supporters of cleric Ruhollah Khomeini, who had been in exile, believed he was routinely slandered by the country's press. On top of this, opposition against Pahlavi's rule blamed his secret police for the Cinema Rex fire that killed 477 people.
The protest of the masses turns into open violence. Tehran is ablaze. The military intervenes.
These, mixed with the Shah using the military to supplant his rule and viciously attacking opponents, caused many people to protest the monarchy.
Watch the current
By
Jack
1979,
this.
this led to Pahlavi fleeing and the return of Ayatollah Khomeini, who became the first supreme leader of Iran, turning the country more politically conservative.
During his 10-year reign, he implemented his ideas of an Islamic revolution with uncompromising vigor and turned Iran into a theocracy.
Some believe this event inspired several uprisings in the Middle East. Number 7, the Stonewall.
Iranian Revolution is taught. Okay, I've taught it both in American history classes because you're also going to get out of it a few things. You get like Iran Contra. You're going to get that's kind of different there, but the like hostage crisis, that kind of thing, but also taught in my world history classes too. So it is something taught, and I think it's very interesting. I actually think it's one of the more interesting things you talk about in more recent history and history classes, because it explains a lot about the tenuous relationship to the United States and Iran. I actually think it's one of the most important things we should be talking about in modern history, because if history is supposed to be useful, then we need to make sure that history is used to explain current events. And the Iranian Revolution is a perfect example of that. So it is taught. Again, if you weren't taught it, it was part of curriculums, at least over the last 30 years. But yes,
All riots.
Who's being taught?
Being
Stonewall riots.
part of the LGBTQ plus community in 1960s New York was rough. The police regularly targeted the then illegal group.
There were no instructions except put them out of business. The first police officer that came in with our group said the place is under arrest.
When people attended LGBTQ plus bars or clubs, many of which were operated by organized criminals, the cops would raid them and arrest those inside, often taking liberties with detainees. By June 1969, the situation hit a boiling point at the Stonewall Inn when the police raided the bar. With years of discrimination, violent attacks by the cops, and inspired by the civil rights movement, the LGBTQ plus community and supporters began rioting, which lasted for several days.
In the civil rights movement, we ran from the police. In the peace movement, we ran from the police. That night, the police ran from us, the lowliest of the low. And it was fantastic.
This sparked LGBTQ plus leaders to petition for rights. By 1970, the first Pride events happened in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco.
Gay Liberation Front was born out of the ashes of Stonewall. Gay Liberation Front is literally why we have everything we have today.
Number 6.
Okay. Yeah, that's an event has not been taught, not institutionally, at least not in like K-12 kind of things. So obviously it's going within the civil rights movement. And I will say something about probably the civil rights movement and it being taught doesn't bring in enough of the different type of rights that people were kind to attach to the larger civil rights movement. You hear mostly about, civil rights of like African Americans. Okay. So you're going to learn about Malcolm X and you're going to learn about Martin Luther King Jr. But yeah, it often does not talk about some of the other things. You're probably going to get a little bit of women's rights movements, push for like, the Equal Rights Amendment or something like that. Maybe you get a little bit of some stuff on the West Coast with like Mexican American farm workers and stuff like that. Maybe a little bit, but the LGBTQ, stuff has not, it seems like, been emphasized in the curriculum as part of the civil rights movement too. So it's probably the biggest reason why you're not seeing that attached to some of the other things with the civil rights movement. So, but they're right about that. Bacon's Rebellion. Okay. Let's see.
Bacon's Rebellion. Way before the American Revolution against Great Britain's reign came to be, the seeds of rebellion were sown in Virginia in 1676. The colonist Nathaniel Bacon was livid at Governor William Berkeley, his cousin, for the high taxes and his lack of support for attacking a Native American settlement. As such, he organized a makeshift militia formed of white and black people to lay siege to Berkeley within Jamestown. Bacon's forces caused the governor to flee as they set Jamestown aflame. By the time England sent a navy to battle the rebellion, Bacon had already passed from dysentery. With a lack of leadership, Berkeley's newly engorged forces defeated the militia, but the governor's reputation was left in tatters. Number 5.
Yeah. That's an event that I know I've talked about it in passing in U.S. history classes, but is probably not emphasized a lot. And the big reason for that is most American history classes try to focus much more on when the United States is, official. Really, a lot of it starting with the American Revolution. The, unit you're probably going to have, depending on how your U.S. history classes are structured, if they're supposed to begin at a certain time or try to begin with, pre-European arrival, whatever it is. But probably regardless of that, your unit or whatever that's supposed to cover, pre-revolution stuff is probably very, very rushed. And that would be one of the things that might get glossed over. So anyway, all right, first bus refuser. Okay.
First bus refuser. While Rosa Parks is credited for ushering in the civil rights movement in the U.S. after refusing to give up her bus seat to a white person in 1955.
Because I didn't think I should have to get up. I had already paid my fare, and I'm sure he didn't pay any more than I did.
there was someone before who made a similar stand. 9 months before this monumental event, 15-year-old student Claudette Colvin refused to move on a bus for white passengers in Montgomery, Alabama. This led to her arrest and being convicted on multiple charges.
I felt as though Harriet Tubman's hand was pushing me down on one shoulder, and Sojourner Truth's hand was pushing me down on another shoulder. And between these two historical women's, iconic women's, I could not move.
Colvin was also involved in the court case that forced Alabama to end bus segregation. But even further back, in 1854 in New York, Elizabeth Jennings Graham was forcibly removed from a whites-only streetcar.
As they rode, he saw a police officer.
Early
The officer came aboard and ignored what Elizabeth had to say, throwing her to the ground and ruining her Sunday best.
So she took the Third Avenue Railroad Company to court and won, causing the firm to desegregate its streetcars. Number 4.
I think, okay, so again, probably what you're looking at here, why, because that probably didn't get talked much, is since it wasn't part of the civil rights movement era, the famous one in the 50s and 60s, probably going to get left out. To hear about stories like this, you're probably going to have to take a women's history class. I mean, I'm just saying that's where you're more likely to hear about that, but there are a lot more stories. I think there does need to be historical context talked about when, like, you're doing a civil rights unit thing. I think it is important to spend some time talking about the movements and the examples of it before the civil rights movement. It's not like nobody was fighting for any kind of civil rights before the civil rights movement. So I don't think it needs to take a long time to talk about, but that's especially with those last two, the two before Rosa Parks, should be tacked on, and just more evidence of that. So, all right, English Civil War. Okay.
English Civil War. While England still has a monarchy, that hasn't always been the case. Charles I clashed with Parliament several times.
Charles distrusted parliaments absolutely, and had governed the country for long periods without recourse to one.
With Catholics facing off against Protestants in several skirmishes adding to the fire, and Charles's religious loyalty questioned, things escalated when he entered the House of Commons and tried and failed to arrest opponents in 1642.
The attempted arrest was a tragic farce. The 5 members had long since escaped by boat. For the first time, a reigning monarch entered the House of Commons only to find himself humiliated.
This kicked off the first of 3 civil wars in England, Scotland, and Wales between the Royalists and the Parliamentarians. In 1649, a captured Charles was tried for treason, found guilty, and executed. By 1651, the Parliamentarians had won the final battle in the Civil War.
Charles died bravely on the scaffold, impeccable courage, but that's no more than would be expected from any gentleman facing the block.
With Oliver Cromwell in charge and later his son Richard, the Commonwealth of England reigned until 1660, when Charles II re-established the monarchy. Number 3, the Armenian.
So, okay, here's what I would say about that. You're not going to hear that in a general ed world history class in the United States. It's just, it has to have more global effects probably for it to be talked about, especially in an American history class. If you're if you're living in England and you're learning about a world history class, you probably still will hear that, but not going to have the, again, international effect to suffice it taking decent amount of time at a time there. Even like with one of the courses I teach, which is AP World History, which is a college level course taught in the United States, it's talked about in passing. There's going to be a little thing on it. Probably not assessed super heavily. Probably the only place in the United States you're going to really hear much about the English Civil War is probably an AP European history class. And when you have something like that, where the monarchy is just going to be reestablished, then it'll be talked about more just about an event in passing. And then it'll get hidden over events that have more, inspirational effects, again, globally, like I've said. So anyway, all right, next one. All right, we're down to the final 3, Armenian Genocide.
Armenian Genocide.
Okay, I thought this would get
in the dying days of the Ottoman Empire, the Young Turk Revolution happened in 1908. After years of Christian Armenians being targeted by the country, they believed this was a positive turning point.
Ethnic groups within the Ottoman Empire were pushing separatist agendas. This rise of nationalism contributed towards the breakdown of the so-called millet system, in which religious communities under Ottoman rule were allowed a degree of autonomy.
Sadly, it wasn't. As nations were engrossed by World War I in 1915, the empire suffered heavy losses. As such, they shifted the blame onto Armenians. Authorities began arresting and either deporting or executing Armenians for treachery. Then, groups were taken from their homes and forced to walk through the Syrian desert without supplies, causing many to perish before they reached the terrible conditions at concentration camps. By 1916, there are estimates that at least 1 million Armenians were massacred in the genocide. Number 2.
Okay. This is one of those things that, so the Armenian genocide, I feel I have fallen victim to. It's not, it is increasingly becoming more important in curriculum discussions and that kind of stuff. And it's going to be in any general, probably world history book or something. It's probably just going to be tacked on into a little phrase or something in a World War I unit, but should be emphasized more, because it's something you might hear about, but probably not to an extent. I know for at least like the AP World History class, it's put together because one of the things we do is compare and compare genocides in history, ones in war and stuff like that. So like bringing that into a discussion that might again later include something like the Holocaust, but like combining those. But it is something that should get talked about more. Probably isn't. They're not a good enough reason why it's not. And I just think because of it going within probably World War I, it's going to get overshadowed a little bit. So, but it is something I think, and I know I need to do a better job of.
Trail of Tears. Ever since Europeans colonized the U.S., Native Americans have experienced many atrocities. In 1829, a gold rush commenced in Georgia, then operated by the Cherokee people. This caused the government to implement forced displacement of native nations so they could take over the resource-rich ground in the Deep South.
In 1829, Andrew Jackson was elected U.S. president. He believed that Native Americans had no rights to their land and began proceedings to remove the Cherokee from the southern states.
Starting in 1830 and ending in 1850, 100,000 people of the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations were forcefully taken from their settlements and taken on a journey to a new place west of the Mississippi known as Indian Territory.
Oklahoma.
Up to a third of the 15,000 Cherokee who were forced to make the journey died on the way, which is one reason that journey came to be known as the Trail of Tears.
Many traveled hundreds of miles and thousands didn't survive. Another atrocity was the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. The U.S. Army slaughtered upwards of 150 people of the Lakota Nation in South Dakota.
We've been living ever since it happened with a lot of sorrow and anger. So I'm looking for a path from victimhood to being victors.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell.
Okay, good time to talk about that one. So of all the things I've heard on this list, at least for American students, this is the one that of all of them is taught the most, is Trail of Tears. Because if you're going to talk at all about any type of interactions with Native Americans, and maybe again the overall subject isn't talked about enough, but like if all that conversation is going to be brought up, Trail of Tears is going to be on that. So maybe it could be done better to talk about it. And maybe it probably, if it's even worthy of being on this list, would be maybe it wasn't taught in a way that can show humanity. It's probably going to be forgotten. And also, if you're teaching, again, American history completely in the view of only like European settlers and European settler history, and not really like seeing it as the history of that region of the world, then you're probably more likely to see the Trail of Tears maybe pushed under a bit. Okay, but yeah, obviously should be a part of it, a major part of American history. So
to get notified about our latest videos, you have the option to be notified and switch on your notifier. In May of 19...
Oh wait, that was 2. This is number 1. Okay.
Number 1, the Tulsa Race Massacre. In May of 1921, the neighborhood of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma was thriving, so much so that it was deemed Black Wall Street. But the segregated city was about to erupt in horrifying violence when black teenager Dick Rowland was falsely arrested.
The newspaper story is published around 3 o'clock. By 4 o'clock, a small group of white men have begun to assemble around and mill around the courthouse.
After the white and black communities faced off outside the courthouse, it sparked into a fight. However, the Greenwood community was outnumbered. Several white residents were deputized, handed weapons, and attacked Greenwood violently for over 18 hours.
I remember the people coming in, white people coming into our house with torches, setting the curtains on fire and setting our house on fire.
On top of buildings being set aflame, as many as 300 people were killed, with 800 injured, while thousands of people lost their homes.
The Red Cross recorded more than 300 people had been killed. Newspapers listed almost 100 deaths, but city officials put the death toll at 36.
In the immediate aftermath, the event was suppressed by the media. Only in recent years has it become more well known.
Yep. Okay. I'm going to talk about this last one here as I transition to full screen. Don't go anywhere. That one, the Tulsa race massacre, as it's been titled, is very deserving to be on a list when you're talking about modern American history, because that, of all the events that they talked about, that is the one that I learned about the latest, and only very recently. To be honest, somebody who has taught U.S. history, like U.S. history classes for years, I never heard about it. I'll admit it. I'd never heard about it. And I've taken a lot of classes, and it does show the success of how it was suppressed. But then when you look at what had happened, it's really unbelievable that it wasn't talked about more, and it isn't talked about more, because it was a major, when you look back on it, a major symbolic defeat for the rise of African Americans in the economic system of the United States, where, like I said, they had like a Black Wall Street, a thriving area of very like great businesses and wealth and stuff, and then it was utterly destroyed in Tulsa. But that is something that I will say, yeah, I can see from my perspective, like that's one of those things that schools didn't teach you. It was not part of it, and not for any like, and because it wasn't curricular like at all. I do think that now a lot of these, because I don't know who was behind this last, is it probably last maybe 5 years, where a lot of this stuff has been, who's been behind like digging up a lot of this information. But I think it's something that really needs to go. It needs to be a core part of U.S. history, taught in U.S. history. It needs to be a curricular thing. So that is, I think, a very good choice to put as number one. So I think Mojo nailed that with that one. And it was one that was realistically something that is not taught in schools. So, but now you can hear why. Because again, as somebody who has studied the curriculum and taught it, it's not in there. It's not in there at all. And hopefully that's changing. Maybe it is changing now as books get updated and curriculums get updated. So anyway, all right. So of this list, let me know, what are some of the things you had never heard about? Why do you think they weren't talked about? Are you taking a more cynical view of it, saying it's intentionally being left out? Is it just a victim of time not being able to talk about? I've also mentioned some of the reasons things don't get talked about is because, especially if it's outside of the United States, is what impact did it actually have? Or is it just an outlier situation that really had no effects? I don't know. But let me know, what do you think should get emphasized more in history as well? Okay, with that, we'll see y'all next time.